Watching my son Daniel's face turn white as he realized that the confused old woman who needed to be kept in the attic had just sold his childhood home for $2.3 million cash to a tech executive, and that the mother he thought was financially dependent on him had been sitting on a real estate empire worth over $8 million that she'd been quietly building for the past 15 years. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next will shock you even more than what I'm about to reveal. The sold sign went up in front of the pristine Colonial on Elmwood Drive in Newton, Massachusetts on a crisp October morning, exactly 48 hours after my 45-year-old son Daniel had informed me that the attic would be perfectly suitable for someone in my current situation. Standing on the sidewalk watching the real estate agent hammer that sign into the manicured front lawn, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in the 2 years since my husband Robert's death. The house that Daniel thought he would inherit, the house where he'd assumed I would live quietly in the cramped attic space while he and his family enjoyed the main floors, had just been sold to the highest bidder without a moment's hesitation. At 70 years old, Eleanor Ellie Hartwell had just made the most expensive point of her life. Never underestimate a woman who's been building wealth while you thought she was just baking cookies and tending gardens. The moving truck would arrive next week to collect my belongings, not to transport them to some assisted living facility or relative's spare room, but to my new 4,000-square-foot waterfront home in Martha's Vineyard that I'd purchased with cash 3 months earlier, while Daniel was still trying to figure out how to manage Mom's declining finances. But watching my son Daniel's face turn white as he realized that the confused old woman who needed to be kept in the attic had just sold his childhood home for $2.3 million cash to a tech executive, and that the mother he thought was financially dependent on him had been sitting on a real estate empire worth over $8 million that she'd been quietly building for the past 15 years. That moment made every second of his condescending treatment worth it. The phone call I was about to make to my son would shatter everything he thought he knew about his mother's capabilities, her resources, and her willingness to accept his version of what was appropriate for a 70-year-old widow. But to understand how Daniel could have been so spectacularly wrong about the woman who raised him, you need to understand the systematic campaign he'd waged over the past 18 months to convince me, and everyone else, that Eleanor Hartwell was no longer capable of managing her own life. The conversation that had led to this moment had taken place just 3 days earlier, on a Sunday afternoon that had started like any other family dinner, but ended with my son essentially offering me charity housing in his attic. Daniel had arrived with his wife Jennifer and their twin 16-year-old daughters, Madison and Mackenzie, ostensibly for our weekly family gathering, but actually for what he'd later described to his friends as a necessary intervention to help Mom face reality. I'd spent the morning preparing Robert's famous pot roast, a recipe I'd been perfecting for 45 years and could make blindfolded. The dining room table was set with our good china, fresh flowers from my prize-winning garden graced the centerpiece, and the house was immaculate as always. Every detail reflected the care and attention I'd been putting into maintaining our family home since Robert's death 2 years earlier. But as Daniel walked through the front door that afternoon, scanning the rooms with the critical eye of someone looking for problems rather than appreciating beauty, I realized that he wasn't seeing any of the evidence of my competence and capability that filled every corner of our home. Instead, he was building a case for why his mother couldn't be trusted to live independently. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation," Daniel had begun after dinner, settling into the leather chair that had been his father's favorite spot. His tone was gentle but firm, the same voice he probably used when explaining to his teenage daughters why they couldn't have something they wanted. "This house is way too big for one person, and frankly, the maintenance and expenses are becoming more than you can handle." I'd looked around the immaculate living room, fresh flowers from my own garden on the mantel, not a speck of dust anywhere, hardwood floors that gleamed from my weekly polishing, windows that sparkled because I'd had them professionally cleaned just the week before. Every system in the house was functioning perfectly, thanks to my carefully maintained network of service providers, contractors, and specialists who'd been helping me manage this property for years. "What exactly about my handling of the situation seems inadequate to you?" I'd asked, genuinely curious about what evidence he was seeing that I was missing. "Mom, you're 70 years old," Jennifer had chimed in with that particular tone wives use. When they're delivering messages, their husbands don't have the courage to say directly. "This place has 3 floors, a huge yard, and all those stairs. What if you fall? What if something major breaks and you can't afford to fix it? What if you have a medical emergency and there's no one here to help you? What if something breaks and I can't afford to fix it?" The irony was almost amusing. If only they had known that the woman they were lecturing about financial responsibility had liquid assets that exceeded their combined net worth by a factor of 10, and that I'd been successfully managing property maintenance, renovations, and improvements for decades while they struggled to keep up with their own mortgage payments. "I appreciate your concern," I'd said carefully, "but I'm not ready to make any major changes to my living situation. I love this house, I'm comfortable here, and I'm perfectly capable of maintaining it." "But Mom, that's exactly the problem," Daniel had pressed, leaning forward with the earnest expression he'd worn since childhood when he was trying to convince me of something. "You think you're capable of maintaining this place, but you're not seeing the bigger picture. The financial burden, the physical demands, the isolation, it's all adding up to a situation that's becoming unsustainable." Unsustainable. The word hung in the air like an accusation. My life, according to my son, was unsustainable. That's when Daniel had pulled out the folder. Because apparently, treating your mother like an incompetent tenant required documentation, spreadsheets, and what he probably thought was compelling evidence. "Mom, we've been doing some research, and we think the best solution would be for you to move in with us permanently," he'd announced, opening the folder to reveal printed pages covered with his handwriting, highlighted sections, and what looked suspiciously like a PowerPoint presentation that had been converted to paper format. "Madison and Mackenzie are busy with college prep and will be leaving for university soon, so they won't be home much longer. You could have the attic space. We've already looked into converting it into a nice little apartment for you. It would be perfect for your needs. The attic space." He was offering me the attic space in a house I'd helped them buy with a $75,000 down payment that had come from the profits of my first major real estate investment that they knew nothing about. The same attic where Jennifer currently stored her seasonal decorations, Daniel's old college textbooks, and boxes of the girls' childhood belongings they couldn't bear to donate. "It would be perfect for your needs," Jennifer had continued, as if she were describing a luxury resort rather than relegating me to the space above their heads where I would be out of sight and, presumably, out of mind. "It's quiet, private, and you'd have access to the main house whenever you wanted to visit with the family. Visit with the family. In the home where I would be living, as if my presence in their daily lives would be an intrusion rather than a natural part of a multi-generational household. The space is actually quite large," Daniel had added, consulting his notes again. "About 600 square feet once we finish it properly. We could install a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and there's room for a sitting area plus sleeping space. You'd have everything you need. Everything I need." They had reduced my needs to 600 square feet of converted storage space, as if 7 decades of life could be efficiently compressed into an attic apartment that would keep me conveniently contained while they lived their lives in the spacious rooms below. "What about this house?" I'd asked, gesturing around the living room where we'd celebrated Daniel's birthdays, where he'd brought Jennifer to meet us for the first time, where Madison and Mackenzie had taken their first steps and said their first words. "Well," Daniel had said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering news they thought was particularly clever, "we think the smartest thing would be to sell it and use the proceeds to help supplement your living expenses and cover the costs of converting the attic space for you. Supplement my living expenses." They had no idea that my living expenses were already supplemented by rental income from 3 investment properties, dividend payments from a carefully curated stock portfolio, and the profits from a small business I'd been running quietly for the past 3 years. "The real estate market is strong right now," Jennifer had added, clearly pleased with their research and planning. "And a house this size in this neighborhood should sell quickly. We've already spoken to a real estate agent who thinks we could list it for around $850,000, maybe $900,000 if we're lucky and find the right buyer." If we're lucky. The house they thought might sell for $900,000 if they were fortunate had already been appraised at $1.8 million by the assessor for my insurance company, and I knew from my own extensive research that similar properties in our neighborhood had been selling for well over $2 million. The colonial 2 streets over, with fewer upgrades and a smaller lot, had sold just last month for $2.1 million. But then again, Daniel and Jennifer had never paid attention to real estate trends, property, values, or investment strategies. They'd been too busy with their own lives to notice that the woman they were trying to manage had been studying these markets for years, attending real estate investment seminars, and building relationships with agents, contractors, and financial advisors who respected her business acumen. "We think this plan addresses all your major concerns," Daniel had continued, clearly warming to his presentation. "You'll have security, family nearby, no maintenance responsibilities, and enough money from the house sale to live comfortably for the rest of your life." The rest of my life. As if at 70, I was supposed to be winding down, accepting limitations, and grateful for whatever accommodations my children chose to provide, rather than continuing to build, create, and pursue my own vision of what my future could look like. "I need to think about this," I'd said, though I already knew exactly what my response would be. "Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need," Daniel had replied with false magnanimity. "But we really think this is the best solution for everyone. You'll be safe, we'll have peace of mind, and the girls will love having their grandmother so close by." The best solution for everyone. Code for the solution that would give them control over my living situation, access to what they assumed were my limited resources, and the satisfaction of having solved the problem of their aging mother without actually having to accommodate my preferences or respect my autonomy. Jennifer had gathered up their papers and folders while Daniel explained the timeline they had in mind. "We're thinking we could start the conversion process in the next few weeks, list your house in early spring when the market picks up, and have you moved in with us by summer. It's perfect timing." Perfect timing. For them, perhaps. For me, it was the perfect moment to demonstrate exactly how wrong they were about every assumption they'd made regarding my capabilities, my resources, and my willingness to accept their version of what was appropriate for my life. That night, lying in the master bedroom of the house I'd shared with Robert for 32 years, the room where we'd planned our financial future, discussed our investment strategies, and built the wealth that our son assumed didn't exist, I'd made the decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to think about their proposal. I wasn't going to negotiate the terms of my surrender. I wasn't going to spend weeks pretending to consider their offer while they pressured me to accept their vision of my future. And I certainly wasn't going to allow myself to be relegated to attic living in a house I'd helped them afford while they controlled my assets and managed my decline. I was going to show them exactly what their mother was capable of when she stopped seeking their approval and started using the resources they had no idea she possessed. The next morning, Monday, I'd made the first of 2 phone calls that would shatter every assumption Daniel and Jennifer had about my financial situation, my decision-making abilities, and my willingness to accept their management of my life. The first call was to Rebecca Martinez, the top real estate agent in Newton, and a woman I'd been quietly consulting with for months about property values, market timing, and investment opportunities in our area. Rebecca was the kind of professional who dealt exclusively with high net worth clients and properties that commanded premium prices. She was also someone who had recognized immediately that Eleanor Hartwell was a serious player in the real estate market, not a confused elderly woman who needed help understanding basic property transactions. "Rebecca, it's Eleanor Hartwell. I'm ready to list the house on Elmwood Drive. I want to move quickly, and I want to price it to sell fast but at full market value." "Eleanor, I've been waiting for this call," Rebecca had replied with the enthusiasm of someone who understood exactly what kind of property we were discussing. "Based on recent comparables and the current market conditions, I think we should list at $2.1 million. With your property's condition, location, and the upgrades you've made over the years, I expect multiple offers within the first week." $2.1 million. More than double what Daniel and Jennifer thought the house was worth, and exactly in line with what I'd been expecting based on my own research and the informal appraisal I'd commissioned 6 months earlier. "What's your timeline for showing?" I'd asked. "I can have professional photos taken today, staging completed by Wednesday, and the listing live by Thursday morning. If you're serious about moving quickly, we'll have this sold within 2 weeks." The second call was to James Chen at Hartwell & Associates, the wealth management firm I'd been working with since Robert's death to grow and diversify the assets my son assumed didn't exist. James was the financial advisor who'd helped me understand that the modest lifestyle Robert and I had maintained during our marriage was supported by investments and business ventures that had grown substantially over the decades, particularly in the 2 years since I'd taken active control of our portfolio. "James, I'm moving forward with the Martha's Vineyard purchase. Wire the funds today. And James, it's time to update my estate planning documents. I have some changes to make regarding my primary beneficiary." "Absolutely, Eleanor. The vineyard property is an excellent investment, and given the current market conditions, you're buying at exactly the right time. Should I arrange for the interior designer to start planning the renovations you discussed?" "Yes. Let's move forward with everything. I want the house ready for occupancy within 6 weeks." By Tuesday morning, Rebecca's team was at the house taking professional photographs that would showcase every detail of the property I'd been lovingly maintaining for over 3 decades. By Wednesday afternoon, staging specialists were arranging furniture and accessories to highlight the home's architectural features and the extensive renovations I'd overseen during the past 2 years. By Thursday morning, the listing was live on every major real estate platform with a price tag of $2.1 million and photographs that made the house look like something from Architectural Digest. By Thursday evening, Rebecca was fielding calls from buyer's agents whose clients were ready to schedule immediate showings. By Friday afternoon, we had the first offer, $2.05 million all cash, 30-day close. By Saturday evening, a bidding war had erupted between 3 serious buyers who recognized that this was exactly the kind of property that rarely came on the market in Newton. By Sunday morning, exactly 1 week after Daniel had suggested I consider attic living, I was reviewing the final offers with Rebecca and preparing to accept the highest bid. The winning offer, $2.3 million, all cash, 15-day close, from a tech executive who'd been looking for exactly this kind of property for his family and was willing to pay premium price to avoid a lengthy bidding process. The sale price was $1.4 million more than what Daniel and Jennifer thought the house was worth if we were lucky. Sunday afternoon, I made the phone call that would change everything Daniel thought he knew about his mother's financial situation and decision-making capabilities. "Daniel, it's Mom. I have some news about the house." "Oh, Mom, have you been thinking about our conversation? Because Jennifer and I have been looking at contractors for the attic conversion, and we think we can have everything ready for you by—" "Daniel, I've sold the house." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and confused, like a child who'd just been told that everything he thought he understood about the world was wrong. "Mom, what do you mean you sold the house? You can't just make a decision like this without consulting the family." "Daniel, the last time I checked, my name was the only one on the deed, and the last time we spoke, you made it very clear that—" You thought I should sell this house and use the proceeds for my living expenses. That's exactly what I'm doing. But we had a plan. We were going to help you through this process. We were going to manage everything so you didn't have to deal with the stress and complexity. Your plan involved me living in your attic and accepting whatever price your chosen real estate agent thought we might get if we were lucky. My plan involved working with the best agent in Newton and selling to the highest bidder at full market value. What do you mean, full market value? How much did you sell it for? $2.3 million cash, 15-day close. The silence that followed was even longer than the first one. I could practically hear Daniel's brain trying to process the fact that the house he thought was worth $900,000 on a good day had just sold for more than twice that amount, and that his supposedly financially incompetent mother had managed the entire transaction without his help or supervision. Mom, where are you going to live? I've purchased a home in Martha's Vineyard. Waterfront property, 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, with a guest cottage that will be perfect for when you and Jennifer want to visit. You purchased a home? With what money? How could you afford? He stopped mid-sentence, and I could hear the wheels turning as he began to realize that there were significant gaps in his understanding of his parents' financial situation. Daniel, your father and I built wealth for 45 years. We invested wisely, saved consistently, and made strategic decisions about real estate and business opportunities. The fact that you never bothered to learn about our financial situation doesn't mean we didn't have one. But you never said anything about having money. You never mentioned investments or business deals, or you never asked. You were too busy telling me what I couldn't afford and what I wasn't capable of managing to bother learning about what I actually owned or how I'd been handling my finances since your father's death. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Daniel alternating between shock, confusion, and what sounded suspiciously like resentment that his mother had turned out to be far more capable and financially secure than he'd believed. Mom, I don't understand. If you have all this money, why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us worry about your finances? I let you worry because you never asked about my actual situation. You assumed I was struggling financially and needed your help. And when I tried to explain that I was managing fine on my own, you interpreted my independence as confusion or denial. But we were just trying to help. You were trying to control. There's a difference, Daniel. The woman Daniel thought he was helping manage her decline was about to become the woman who would force him to reconsider every assumption he'd ever made about aging, capability, and the relationship between parents and adult children. The attic, space he'd thought was suitable for his mother, was about to become a metaphor for how small his vision of her had been. And the house sale that was supposed to solve his mother's financial problems was about to become the foundation for her most dramatic declaration of independence. The moving truck would arrive on Friday to transport my belongings to Martha's Vineyard, where I would begin the next chapter of my life, in a home that reflected my actual resources and preferences rather than my son's limitations and misconceptions. But tonight, sitting in this beautiful living room for the last time, I was savoring the satisfaction of a point perfectly made. The woman Daniel had underestimated was about to show him exactly what his mother was capable of when she stopped accepting his version of what was possible for someone her age, someone her gender, and someone he'd decided needed his management and protection, and it was going to be magnificent. What Daniel and Jennifer didn't know as they sat in their suburban living room that Sunday evening, congratulating themselves on having solved the mom problem with their attic solution, was that the woman they had just relegated to storage space was sitting on a real estate portfolio worth $8.3 million. While they worried about my ability to afford basic home maintenance, I owned 3 rental properties in Cambridge that generated $18,000 per month in passive income. While they fretted about my declining cognitive abilities, I had been successfully managing a property investment business that had outperformed the S&P 500 by 12% over the past 5 years. While they assumed I needed their financial guidance, I had liquid assets that could fund their children's college educations 3 times over without making a dent in my principal. But here's the thing about being systematically underestimated by your own family. You learn to keep your capabilities and resources private, because every time you've tried to share your successes in the past, they've found ways to diminish them, question your judgment, or suggest that you've been lucky rather than skillful. When Robert died 2 years ago, I had expected Daniel to support me through my grief while I transitioned from being half of a partnership to being a complete individual. What I got instead was a son who immediately positioned himself as the wise adult who needed to guide his confused elderly mother through every aspect of widowhood, from financial planning to social activities to basic life decisions. The truth was, Robert and I had been far more financially successful than Daniel realized, but our success had been built on careful planning, strategic investments, and a deliberately modest lifestyle that allowed us to accumulate wealth without drawing attention to our growing net worth. We'd learned early in our marriage that financial security came from living below your means and investing the difference, not from displaying your wealth through expensive cars, luxury vacations, or status symbols that impressed the neighbors. Robert had started his career as a mechanical engineer at Raytheon, but by the time he retired, he was consulting for defense contractors across New England and commanding fees that reflected his expertise in advanced manufacturing systems. More importantly, he had parlayed his technical knowledge into investments in companies whose innovations he understood better than most financial analysts. But I hadn't just been the supportive wife who managed the household while Robert built our fortune. I had been his business partner in every sense of the word, handling client development, contract negotiations, project management, and financial planning for over 2 decades. Many of our biggest consulting contracts had come through relationships I'd developed, proposals I'd written, and client management strategies I'd implemented. When Robert became ill 3 years ago, I had seamlessly taken over the business operations while caring for him. When he died, I hadn't lost my business partner. I had lost my collaborator, but I had retained all the knowledge, relationships, and capabilities that had made our partnership successful. Daniel had interpreted my temporary withdrawal from active business development as evidence that I had never been truly capable, that I had only functioned as an extension of Robert's talents. He had no idea that 6 months after Robert's funeral, I had quietly transformed our consulting practice into Eleanor Hartwell Property Solutions, a real estate investment and management company that specialized in identifying undervalued properties in emerging neighborhoods around Boston. My first major acquisition had been a 3-family house in Somerville that the previous owner was selling because he couldn't handle the challenges of being a landlord. The property was structurally sound but cosmetically tired, located in a neighborhood that was clearly on the verge of gentrification, but hadn't yet attracted the attention of major developers. I'd purchased the building for $485,000, invested $65,000 in strategic renovations that focused on modern kitchens and bathrooms while preserving the original character, and transformed it into 3 luxury rental units that commanded premium rents from young professionals who wanted to live close to Boston, but couldn't afford downtown prices. Within 18 months, similar properties in the neighborhood were selling for over $700,000, and my renovated units were generating $6,400 per month in rental income against a monthly mortgage payment of $2,100. The property had become a cash-generating asset that also appreciated in value, providing both monthly income and long-term wealth building. But when I'd mentioned to Daniel that I was looking into some real estate opportunities, his response had been immediate concern about my ability to handle such complex financial decisions. "Mom, real estate investing is really complicated and risky," he'd said with the authority of someone who'd never owned anything more challenging than his own home. "There are a lot of people who target elderly investors with deals that sound good but end up being scams or money pits." When I'd tried to explain that I was working with reputable agents, conducting thorough due diligence, and focusing on properties with strong fundamentals in appreciating neighborhoods, he'd suggested that I was getting in over my head and should stick to simple, safe investments like CDs and treasury bonds. So I'd learned to keep my real estate activities private while Daniel continued to treat me like someone who needed protection from my own poor judgment. My second acquisition had been even more successful. An estate sale in Cambridge had presented an opportunity to purchase a Victorian duplex that had been owned by the same family for 60 years. The property was a time capsule of 1960s decorating choices and deferred maintenance, but the bones were solid and the location was prime, 3 blocks from Harvard Square and walking distance to the Red Line. The family was motivated to sell, quickly to settle the estate, and most potential buyers were intimidated by the amount of work required to modernize the property. I saw an opportunity to create something special while building wealth through forced appreciation. I'd purchased the duplex for $890,000, invested $180,000 in a comprehensive renovation that transformed it into 2 stunning luxury apartments, and leased both units to Harvard professors who were thrilled to find high-end housing in their preferred neighborhood. The renovated property was now worth approximately $1.6 million and generated $8,200 per month in rental income. More importantly, the renovation process had taught me valuable lessons about contractor management, permit processes, and design decisions that would prove invaluable for future projects. My third property acquisition had been the most ambitious. A small apartment building in Porter Square had come on the market when the owner decided he was tired of dealing with tenant management and building maintenance. The 4-unit building was fully occupied but underperforming financially because the owner hadn't raised rents in years and hadn't invested in improvements that would justify higher rental rates. I'd seen the potential to implement a systematic renovation and repositioning strategy that would transform the building from a tired rental property into a premium housing option for young professionals and graduate students. The purchase price of $1.2 million seemed high to casual observers, but my analysis showed that strategic improvements could increase rental income by 40% while also driving significant appreciation. Over the course of 18 months, I'd renovated each unit as tenants moved out, upgrading kitchens, bathrooms, flooring, and fixtures while adding modern amenities like in-unit laundry, central air conditioning, and high-speed internet infrastructure. The transformed building now generated $11,600 per month in rental income and was valued at approximately $1.9 million, but perhaps most importantly, the renovation process had connected me with a network of contractors, designers, and property management professionals who respected my business acumen and enjoyed working on projects where quality was prioritized over cutting corners. My contractor, Miguel Rodriguez, had worked with me on all 3 major renovations and had become both a trusted business partner and a friend who appreciated my attention to detail and willingness to invest in superior craftsmanship. "Mrs. Hartwell, you understand something that most property owners don't," Miguel had told me after we completed the Porter Square project. "You know that doing things right the first time costs less than fixing things later, and you understand that tenants will pay premium rents for premium quality." My property manager, Sarah Chen, handled day-to-day tenant relations and maintenance coordination for all 3 buildings, but she regularly consulted with me about major decisions and market positioning strategies. "Eleanor, you have better instincts about rental markets and tenant preferences than most full-time real estate investors," Sarah had said when we reviewed our quarterly performance reports. "Your properties consistently outperform the market because you understand what tenants actually want and you're willing to invest in providing it." These weren't people who saw me as a confused elderly woman who needed careful supervision. These were professionals who sought out my business because they knew I made good decisions, paid promptly, and created opportunities for them to showcase their best work. But Daniel had no idea that his mother commanded this level of professional respect. In his mind, I was still the woman who called him for help, programming the television remote. The financial success of my real estate investments had allowed me to build wealth at a pace that would have been impossible through traditional retirement planning. In the 2 years since Robert's death, my net worth had increased by $2.8 million, not through inheritance or lucky breaks, but through strategic property acquisitions, value-added improvements, and systematic wealth building. My portfolio now included the original family home in Newton, recently sold for $2.3 million, the Somerville 3 family, worth approximately $850,000, with $4,300 monthly net income. The Cambridge duplex, worth approximately $1.6 million, with $6,800 monthly net income. The Porter Square 4-unit building, worth approximately $1.9 million, with $9,200 monthly net income. The Martha's Vineyard waterfront home, purchased for $1.8 million in cash, liquid investments, and savings accounts totaling $1.2 million, combined net worth, $8.35 million monthly passive income from rentals, $20,300 annual gross income from all sources, $287,000. But the numbers only told part of the story. More important than the wealth I'd accumulated was the expertise I'd developed and the confidence I'd gained from successfully managing complex business operations without anyone's help or supervision. I had learned to evaluate market conditions, analyze property fundamentals, negotiate purchase agreements, manage renovation projects, screen and select tenants, handle legal compliance issues, and coordinate with attorneys, accountants, contractors, and service providers across multiple properties. I had developed relationships with bankers who competed for my business, real estate agents who brought me off-market opportunities, and industry professionals who valued my reputation for fair dealing and prompt payment. I had built systems for property management, financial tracking, tax planning, and investment analysis that allowed me to operate efficiently while maintaining high standards for tenant satisfaction and property maintenance. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that Eleanor Hartwell was capable of building something significant from scratch, making complex decisions under pressure, and succeeding in a competitive business environment without relying on anyone else's approval or assistance. But none of this success had been visible to Daniel because he'd never asked about my activities, never expressed interest in my post-retirement plans, and never considered the possibility that his mother might be building something remarkable while he was worrying about her declining capabilities. The gap between his perception and my reality had become a source of quiet amusement for me over the past year. While he worried about my isolation, I was attending real estate investment meetings, networking events, and industry conferences where my expertise was sought after and respected. While he fretted about my limited income, I was generating more monthly passive income than his annual salary and building wealth at a rate that would make most financial advisors envious. While he assumed I needed his guidance to make major decisions, I was successfully managing a business portfolio that required me to make critical judgment calls every week about acquisitions, improvements, tenant relations, and strategic planning. The woman sitting in that living room during his attic intervention wasn't someone who had been reduced to accepting charity housing from her children. She was someone who had been building an empire while her son was trying to figure out how to manage her decline. When Robert died, I had faced a choice. I could accept the limited role Daniel seemed to expect from elderly widows, or I could use my freedom to build something that reflected my actual capabilities and ambitions. I had chosen to build. The financial independence I'd achieved meant that I never had to accept anyone else's definition of what was appropriate for someone my age, my gender, or my supposed limitations. I could live where I wanted, spend money on what mattered to me, and pursue projects that challenged me intellectually and creatively. More importantly, I had learned something valuable about the psychology of family dynamics. Adult children often need their parents to be dependent because it gives them purpose and importance. Daniel's concern about my capabilities wasn't entirely about my well-being. It was also about his need to feel necessary and in control. But the Martha's Vineyard property purchase had been about more than just buying a beautiful home. It had been about creating physical space between myself and the family members who couldn't see me clearly, while also making an investment that would continue building wealth and provide a legacy asset for future generations. The 200-square-foot waterfront home sat on 3 acres with 200 feet of private beach frontage. The property included a main house with 4 bedrooms and 3.5 bathrooms, plus a separate guest cottage that could accommodate visitors or be used as a home office. But beyond the luxury amenities, the vineyard property represented something more significant: proof that I could make major life decisions based on my own preferences rather than other people's expectations. I had chosen the location because I loved being near the water, not because it was close to family members who might need to check on me. I had chosen the size because I wanted space for entertaining, pursuing hobbies, and potentially hosting business meetings, not because someone else had decided what was appropriate for my needs. I had chosen to pay cash because I could afford to, and because owning the property outright gave me complete control over my living situation without anyone else having financial leverage over my choices. The interior design and renovation plans I'd developed with my decorator, Patricia Williams, reflected my personal taste and lifestyle preferences rather than anyone else's ideas about age-appropriate living. "Eleanor, this is going to be stunning," Patricia had said as we reviewed the plans for updating the kitchen, master suite, and entertaining spaces. "You've created a design that's both sophisticated and comfortable, and the way you're integrating indoor and outdoor living spaces shows real understanding of how to maximize the waterfront location." The renovation budget of $400,000 might have seemed extravagant to someone like Daniel, who worried about the cost of basic home maintenance. But for someone with my resources and business experience, it was a strategic investment in creating a living environment that would provide enjoyment and continue appreciating in value. The timing of the Martha's Vineyard purchase had been deliberate. I had closed on the property 3 months before Daniel's attic intervention, but I hadn't mentioned it to him because I knew he would respond with concerns about the expense, questions about my decision-making process, and suggestions that I was taking unnecessary risks. Instead, I had quietly handled the entire transaction, from initial property search through closing and renovation planning, without seeking anyone's input or approval. The experience had been liberating in ways that went far beyond the financial aspects. For the first time since Robert's death, I had made a major life decision based entirely on my own preferences, timeline, and vision for my future. I hadn't needed to justify my choices to anyone, defend my judgment, or compromise my plans to accommodate other people's comfort levels. The independence I felt during that process had reminded me of who I was before I became someone's wife and mother. Woman capable of making complex decisions, managing multiple priorities, and creating the life she wanted, rather than accepting the life others thought she should have. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the Martha's Vineyard purchase was the way it positioned me for the confrontation I knew was coming with Daniel. When he finally learned about my real financial situation and capability level, the waterfront property would serve as concrete proof that his assessment of my judgment and resources had been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. The house he thought I should sell for $900,000 if we were lucky, had funded the purchase of a $1.8 million luxury property that I'd bought with cash while he was still trying to figure out how to help me manage my finances. The woman he thought needed attic housing had created a living situation that most people would consider a reward for a lifetime of successful financial planning and business management. The mother he'd been trying to protect from making poor decisions had demonstrated decision-making capabilities that far exceeded his own experience with major purchases and life planning. As I sat in my soon-to-be former living room that Sunday evening, reviewing the real estate documents that would finalize my transition to the next phase of my life, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death: complete confidence in my own judgment and abilities. The woman Daniel thought he was managing was about to become the woman whose success would force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about aging. competence, and the relationship between parents and adult children. The attic space he'd offered as charity was about to become a symbol of how limited his vision of his mother had been, and the intervention he'd staged to solve my problems was about to become the catalyst for the most dramatic demonstration of my capabilities he would ever witness. The phone call I would make to him in the morning wouldn't just inform him about the house sale. It would shatter every assumption he'd made about my resources, my judgment, and my willingness to accept his version of what was appropriate for my life. The woman he'd underestimated was about to prove that competence, ambition, and the ability to build wealth don't diminish with age. They actually improve when you're no longer worried about other people's approval and can focus entirely on your own vision of what's possible. And Daniel was about to learn that the most expensive mistake of his life had been assuming that his 70-year-old mother was someone who needed his management rather than someone whose capabilities far exceeded his own. The reckoning was going to be swift, decisive, and absolutely magnificent. To understand how my 45-year-old son could offer his 70-year-old mother attic housing and consider it a reasonable solution, you need to understand the family dynamic that had been systematically building since Robert's death 2 years ago. This wasn't a spontaneous act of thoughtless cruelty. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign to convince me that I was incompetent, financially vulnerable, and grateful for whatever assistance my children chose to provide. The transformation in how Daniel treated me didn't happen overnight. It began subtly, in the weeks after Robert's funeral, when I was most vulnerable and least likely to recognize manipulation for what it was. What started as seemingly helpful concern gradually evolved into systematic control, as Daniel positioned himself as the wise adult who needed to guide his confused elderly mother through every aspect of widowhood. Robert and I had been married for 43 years. We'd built a life together that was financially secure, intellectually stimulating, and deeply satisfying. He handled the technical aspects of our consulting business and the complex mathematical calculations required for our investment strategies, while I managed client relationships, business development, project coordination, and the interpersonal dynamics that kept our operations running smoothly. We complemented each other professionally and personally in ways that made both of us more capable and effective than we could have been individually. When Robert died after a brief but devastating battle with pancreatic cancer, I felt like I'd lost not just my husband, but my business partner, my closest friend, and the person who best understood my capabilities and potential. During those first months of widowhood, I was genuinely struggling to figure out who I was as an individual after 4 decades of being half of a perfectly matched partnership. I was learning to make decisions that Robert and I had always made together, managing business relationships that had been built around our collaborative approach, and trying to envision what my life could look like when I was no longer someone's wife, but simply myself. I needed support, patience, and encouragement while I found my footing as a single person for the first time since I was 26 years old. What I got instead was a systematic campaign to convince me that I would never be capable of managing my own life without constant supervision and guidance. Daniel, who had always been what you might charitably call protective, seemed to interpret my temporary vulnerability as evidence of permanent incompetence. Rather than understanding that grief and adjustment are normal parts of the widowhood transition, he began treating every moment of sadness, confusion, or uncertainty as proof that his mother was declining and needed intervention. My daughter-in-law, Jennifer, who had always been somewhat competitive about household management and family organization, appeared to see my widow status as an opportunity to position herself as the family's primary female authority figure. She began offering advice about everything from meal planning to home maintenance, with the confidence of someone who'd never managed a property portfolio or coordinated complex business operations. But perhaps most damaging was the way they began, involving other people in their narrative about my supposed decline. This wasn't just about convincing me that I needed help. It was about building consensus among our extended family and social circle, that Eleanor Hartwell was losing her capacity for independent living. The first person they recruited to their cause was Robert's brother Thomas, who lived in Hartford and had always been the more traditional of the two brothers. Thomas believed strongly in conventional family hierarchies where adult children naturally assumed responsibility for aging parents, and he had limited patience for what he called stubborn independence in elderly relatives. Daniel called Thomas within a week of Robert's funeral to discuss Mom's situation and express his concerns about my ability to manage alone. "Uncle Thomas, I'm really worried about Mom," I overheard Daniel saying during a phone conversation that was supposedly private. "She's not handling Dad's death well, and I think she's struggling more than she wants to admit. She keeps insisting she can manage the house and finances on her own, but I think she needs more support than she's willing to accept." The phone call lasted over an hour, with Daniel detailing every moment of normal grief behavior as evidence of concerning decline. My tears during Robert's memorial service became emotional instability. My difficulty sleeping in the weeks after his death became signs of depression that might affect her judgment. My decision to postpone major household projects while I focused on estate settlement became evidence that she's overwhelmed by basic responsibilities. When Thomas called me the next day, his tone was gentle but patronizing in a way that immediately made me defensive. "Eleanor, sweetheart, Daniel tells me you're having a rough time adjusting to life without Robert. That's completely understandable. But maybe it would be helpful to accept some assistance from family members who want to support you through this transition." "I'm managing fine, Thomas. Grief is difficult, but I'm handling everything that needs to be handled." "But honey, maybe managing fine isn't the same as thriving. Daniel and Jennifer are worried that you're putting unnecessary pressure on yourself to maintain Robert's level of independence when it might be healthier to lean on family during this difficult time." That conversation established a pattern that would continue for months. Family members expressing concern about my stubborn independence and suggesting that my desire to handle my own affairs was evidence of poor judgment, rather than normal autonomy. Over the following weeks, similar conversations happened with my sister Patricia in Baltimore, Robert's sister Caroline in Portland, and several longtime family friends who had been told that I was struggling with the transition and needed encouragement to accept help, gracefully. Each person who called expressed the same gentle concern about my emotional state and the same suggestion that I should allow Daniel to help with various aspects of managing my new life. The message was clear. Everyone who mattered in my life had been told that I was struggling beyond my capacity and needed intervention from responsible family members. The brilliant manipulation was that if I protested or tried to explain that I was actually handling things quite well, I would sound defensive, paranoid, or exactly like someone experiencing emotional breakdown who lacked insight into her own problems. Daniel had effectively isolated me by creating a narrative that made any objection to his involvement sound like confirmation of my incompetence. The next phase of his campaign involved what he called helpful suggestions about modifying my daily routines and living arrangements to make them safer and more manageable for someone in my current situation. But these weren't genuine safety improvements. They were systematic attempts to make my independent lifestyle feel burdensome and inappropriate, which would support his argument that I needed more supervised living arrangements. It started with transportation. I had been driving safely for over 50 years, with only one minor accident that had been the other driver's fault. But suddenly, every trip I took became an opportunity for Daniel to express elaborate concerns about my safety behind the wheel. "Mom, are you sure you should be driving to the grocery store in this weather?" he would ask whenever there was any possibility of rain, snow, or even overcast skies. "Your reflexes aren't what they used to be, and there are so many distracted drivers out there these days." When I pointed out that I'd been driving in New England weather for decades and had never had weather-related difficulties, he would frame his concerns as coming from love. "I just worry about you, Mom. If something happened to you while you were driving, I'd never forgive myself for not speaking up." The driving concerns escalated to suggestions that I should limit my trips to essential errands and ask for rides instead of driving myself places. "Mom, why don't you call me when you need to go somewhere? I'm happy to take you, and that way we know you arrived safely." But when I did call for rides, Daniel was often unavailable, too busy with work, or could only accommodate my schedule at times that didn't work for my appointments. The message was clear. I should limit my activities to what was convenient for him when it was convenient for him. He also began expressing skepticism about my social activities and friendships, particularly my relationships with other widows who were living independently and pursuing active lifestyles. When I mentioned having lunch with my friend Catherine Morrison, who was 72 and had been widowed for 3 years, Daniel would ask probing questions. "What do you really know about Catherine's mental state? Are you sure she's a good influence on your emotional recovery?" Sometimes people in similar situations can reinforce each other's denial about the help they need. When I talked about activities at the local senior center, book clubs, art classes, and social groups I'd been participating in for years, Daniel would suggest that I was wearing myself out and should take things slower while you're processing your grief. When I mentioned new people I'd met or places I'd gone, Jennifer would warn me about people who target vulnerable seniors and suggest I should be more cautious about trusting strangers during this emotional time. Over time, it became easier to stop mentioning my social activities than to deal with their constant warnings and concerns. They interpreted my silence as evidence that I was, indeed, becoming isolated and dependent on them for social interaction. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of their campaign was the way they weaponized my grief to undermine my confidence in my own judgment and emotional stability. Every normal part of the grieving process was reinterpreted as evidence that I was not coping well and needed professional intervention. When I mentioned missing Robert during what would have been our 43rd wedding anniversary, Daniel immediately suggested that I should consider grief counseling. "Mom, if you're still having this much trouble with emotional regulation after 6 months, it might be helpful to talk to someone professional about healthy coping strategies." When I decided to redecorate the master bedroom to make it feel less like a shrine to my married life and more like a space that reflected my individual taste, Jennifer expressed concern about my decision-making process. "Are you sure you're ready to make major changes like this? Sometimes people make dramatic alterations when they're not thinking clearly, and then they regret them later." When I mentioned considering a vacation to visit Catherine Morrison in Florida, something that would have helped me process my grief while maintaining important friendships, Daniel launched into a lecture about the risks of travel for seniors in your emotional state. "Mom, traveling alone right now might not be the best idea. You're dealing with a lot of emotional stress, and being in an unfamiliar place without family support could be overwhelming. Every normal human experience, missing my deceased husband, wanting to update my living space, desiring social connection and new experiences, was being reinterpreted as evidence of emotional instability or poor judgment that required family supervision. But the most damaging manipulation was the way Daniel began using my grandchildren, his daughters Madison and Mackenzie, to reinforce the narrative about my emotional fragility and need for careful management. The twins, who were 14 at the time and had always enjoyed spending time with their grandmother, suddenly began receiving detailed instructions from their parents about how to interact with me during family visits. "Girls, remember that Grandma is going through a really difficult time right now," I overheard Jennifer telling them before one Sunday dinner. "She might seem sad or confused sometimes, and it's important that you're patient with her. If she says anything that worries you or seems strange, make sure you tell us about it later." The girls, who had always related to me as their capable, fun-loving grandmother who baked cookies, helped with homework, and told entertaining stories about their father's childhood, suddenly began treating me with the careful concern normally reserved for someone recovering from serious illness. "Grandma, are you feeling okay today?" Madison would ask, with the solemn expression of a teenager who'd been told her grandmother was fragile. Dad said we should make sure you're not getting too tired during our visits. Grandma, do you need help remembering anything? Mackenzie would inquire with the gentle tone someone might use with a person experiencing memory problems. Mom said sometimes people your age have trouble keeping track of things. Our easy, affectionate relationship gradually became stilted and careful, as if they were visiting a sick relative rather than spending time with their grandmother. Every interaction was filtered through their parents' concerns about my mental state and emotional stability. To reinforce their narrative that I couldn't handle independent living, Daniel and Jennifer began creating artificial emergencies that required their intervention and demonstrated my supposed inability to manage basic adult responsibilities. It started with maintenance emergencies that they insisted were evidence of my failure to properly care for the house. When a bathroom faucet developed a small drip, the kind of minor issue that any homeowner might experience, Daniel arrived unannounced with a plumber and a lecture about the importance of staying on top of small problems before they become major disasters. Mom, this could have caused serious water damage if we hadn't caught it in time, he announced, as if a slow drip that I'd already planned to have repaired represented some kind of household crisis. You need to be more proactive about maintenance issues. When I pointed out that I'd noticed the drip and was planning to call a plumber myself, he suggested that my delay in addressing it immediately showed that I was overwhelmed by the responsibilities of homeownership. Maybe it's time to think about whether maintaining this big house is really the best use of your energy, Jennifer added helpfully. There are so many beautiful senior living communities where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance issues at all. The artificial emergencies escalated over the following months. A loose handrail on the front steps became evidence that I wasn't maintaining the property safely. A burnt-out light bulb in the basement became proof that I wasn't staying on top of basic household tasks. A small oil stain in the driveway became a sign that I was neglecting property care. Each minor issue was treated as a crisis that required immediate family intervention and served as evidence that independent living was becoming too challenging for someone my age. But perhaps the most manipulative tactic was the way Daniel began, involving healthcare professionals in his campaign, using my routine medical appointments as opportunities to plant seeds about my supposed emotional instability and cognitive decline. When I went for my annual physical with Dr. Patricia Williams, Daniel insisted on accompanying me for support and to make sure all your questions get answered. But once we were in the doctor's office, he began sharing his concerns about my behavior changes since Robert's death. Dr. Williams, we're worried that Mom might be experiencing some depression or anxiety that's affecting her judgment, Daniel said, speaking about me as if I weren't sitting right there. She's been having trouble with things like home maintenance, and she seems to be isolating herself from family activities. Dr. Williams, who had been my physician for 12 years and knew me well, looked puzzled. Mrs. Hartwell, how are you? Feeling? Are you experiencing symptoms of depression or anxiety that are interfering with your daily activities? I feel fine, Dr. Williams. I'm adjusting to life without Robert, which is normal and healthy. I haven't been having trouble with home maintenance or any other daily activities. She doesn't always have clear insight into the changes we're observing, Daniel added quickly. Sometimes people experiencing cognitive or emotional changes aren't aware of the symptoms themselves. The appointment that should have been a routine health check became an exercise in defending my mental competence against claims made by my own son. Dr. Williams, to her credit, conducted her own assessment and found no evidence of cognitive decline or concerning depression. But the fact that questions had been raised created a record that Daniel could point to as evidence that even healthcare professionals were concerned about my mental state. He used the same tactic with my dentist, my eye doctor, and even the pharmacist at my local drugstore. Each professional interaction became an opportunity for him to express concerns about my cognitive function, my emotional stability, or my ability to manage my medications safely. The cumulative effect was that Daniel was creating a paper trail of concerns from multiple sources that would make his eventual intervention seem not just reasonable, but medically necessary. The most devastating escalation came when Daniel began undermining my relationship with Catherine Morrison, who had become my closest friend and strongest source of support since Robert's death. Catherine was 72, had been widowed for 3 years, and understood something about grief and adjustment that my family members seemed incapable of grasping. Catherine had successfully navigated her own transition from wife to independent woman. She lived alone in her own home, managed her own finances, traveled regularly, and maintained an active social life that demonstrated it was possible to thrive as an elderly widow rather than merely survive. More importantly, Catherine was the one person who consistently supported my independence and questioned my family's increasing involvement in my daily life. "Eleanor," Catherine had said after witnessing one of Daniel's welfare checks at my house, "I don't understand why your son treats you like you're incompetent. You're one of the sharpest, most capable women I know. My children check in with me regularly, but they don't act like I need supervision for basic life decisions." But Daniel and Jennifer saw Catherine's support for my independence as a threat to their narrative about my need for family management. So they began working systematically to undermine our friendship by suggesting that Catherine wasn't a good influence on my emotional recovery. "Mom, we're concerned about how much time you're spending with Catherine," Daniel said during one of his increasingly frequent visits to my house. "She's encouraging you to resist help that might be beneficial for your well-being." "Catherine is my friend, Daniel. She's been a wonderful source of support since your father died. But Mom, Catherine is dealing with her own grief and adjustment issues. Sometimes people in similar situations can reinforce each other's denial about the help they need. It might be healthier for you to spend time with family members who can offer more objective perspectives." Jennifer took a more direct approach, scheduling family activities and important conversations, at times when she knew I had plans with Catherine, forcing me to choose between my friendship and my relationship with my children. "Mom, we need to have a family meeting this Saturday afternoon to discuss some important financial planning issues," Jennifer would announce, knowing perfectly well that Catherine and I had tickets to a matinee performance at the local theater. When Xiao, I protested that I already had commitments. The response was always the same. "Mom, your family needs to be your priority right now. Catherine will understand that you have responsibilities to take care of." They also began making subtle comments about Catherine's influence on my decision-making, suggesting that she was encouraging me to be unnecessarily resistant to their reasonable suggestions. "Mom, we know Catherine means well, but she doesn't understand the full scope of what we're dealing with as a family," Daniel said during one particularly manipulative conversation. "She's not seeing the memory issues and emotional instability that we're witnessing on a daily basis because she only sees you for a few hours at a time." The message was clear. My closest friend was either not observant enough to recognize my problems, or she was actively encouraging me to make dangerous decisions by resisting their well-intentioned guidance. Over time, these tactics began to work. I found myself second-guessing conversations I'd had with Catherine, wondering if she was indeed encouraging me to be unreasonably independent. I started declining some of her invitations to avoid creating conflict with my children, and I began to feel increasingly isolated from the one person who had been consistently supportive of my autonomy and emotional well-being. The final phase of Daniel's campaign involved financial pressure designed to make me more dependent on his assistance and more willing to accept his management of my resources. He couldn't access my accounts directly, but he could create expenses and situations that would make me feel financially vulnerable and grateful for his help. It started with offers to help with financial planning that were actually attempts to gain control over my decision-making process. Daniel would arrive with printouts of articles about financial scams targeting seniors, and suggest that I needed protection from my own potentially poor judgment. "Mom, there are a lot of people who target elderly women with investment schemes that sound good, but are actually designed to steal your money," he would say, with the authority of someone who'd never managed anything more complex than his own. checking account. Maybe it would be safer to simplify your investments and let me help you monitor your accounts. When I pointed out that I'd been successfully managing our family's investments for decades and felt confident in my ability to continue doing so, he would suggest that my confidence itself was evidence of the problem. But Mom, that's exactly what makes you vulnerable. Scammers rely on people who think they're too smart to be fooled. Sometimes the safest approach is to admit that you might not have all the information you need to make these decisions on your own. He also began questioning every significant purchase I made, no matter how reasonable or well-planned. When I bought a new washing machine to replace our 15-year-old unit that had finally broken down, Daniel expressed concern about my spending patterns. Mom, did you really need to buy the most expensive model? Are you sure you're not being influenced by salespeople who are trying to take advantage of your situation? When I explained that I'd researched different options, compared features and prices, and chosen a model that would be efficient and reliable for years to come, he suggested that my research process showed I was getting overwhelmed by too many choices and should have asked for help. Next time, why don't you call me before making major purchases? I can help you evaluate the options and make sure you're getting good value for your money. Every financial decision I made became an opportunity for him to position himself as the wise advisor who needed to protect me from my own poor judgment, even when my decisions were clearly rational and well-considered. By the time Daniel staged his final intervention, the Sunday dinner where he presented his attic proposal and made it clear that my independence was no longer negotiable, he had successfully created a comprehensive case for why Eleanor Hartwell needed family management. On the paper, his argument was compelling. A 70-year-old widow experiencing prolonged grief, social isolation, poor judgment about safety issues, questionable financial decision-making, and resistance to reasonable family assistance clearly needed intervention from responsible adult children who were offering practical alternatives. The reality that a competent, financially successful, emotionally healthy woman was being systematically manipulated by a son who needed to control her in order to feel important was much harder to prove and more difficult for outsiders to recognize. But as I sat in that living room listening to Daniel explain why the attic would be perfect for my needs, I realized that he had made one crucial mistake in his 18-month campaign. He had been so focused on tearing down my confidence and proving my incompetence that he had never bothered to investigate what I was actually capable of when I stopped seeking his approval and started using my own resources. He thought he knew the whole story. He thought he had successfully managed his problem mother by creating circumstances that would force her into the supervised living situation he believed was appropriate. But he had no idea that the woman he had dismissed and manipulated was about to demonstrate capabilities that would make his entire campaign look not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. The house sale that would happen in the next week wasn't just about moving to a new location. It was about proving that everything Daniel thought he knew about his mother was nothing more than the product of his own need to feel superior and necessary. The systematic campaign he had waged against my independence was about to become the foundation for my most dramatic declaration of autonomy. And he was about to learn that underestimating Eleanor Hartwell was the most expensive mistake of his life. After 18 months of gradual manipulation, Daniel's campaign to establish control over my life shifted into overdrive during the final 6 months before his attic proposal. What had been subtle undermining and gentle pressure suddenly became an aggressive, coordinated effort to prove that I was incompetent and needed immediate intervention. He had tasted success with his smaller manipulations, and now he was circling, like a predator who sensed weakness. The change was dramatic and unmistakable. Within a week of what I now recognize as his first major test, a manufactured crisis involving a supposedly dangerous electrical issue in my basement, Daniel had produced a comprehensive action plan for managing what he called my declining cognitive function and decision-making capacity. But perhaps most telling was the way he began involving professionals in his campaign. This wasn't just about convincing me that I needed help. It was about building an official record with lawyers, doctors, financial advisors, and social workers that would make his eventual decisions about my living situation seem not only reasonable, but legally and medically necessary. The first professional he recruited was Dr. Sarah Martinez, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in what the marketing materials euphemistically called family transitions and elder care planning. Daniel had found Dr. Martinez through what he told me was research into the best resources for families dealing with aging-related challenges. "Mom, I've scheduled an appointment for you with Dr. Martinez," Daniel announced during one of his increasingly frequent unannounced visits. "She's a specialist who helps families navigate the emotional and practical aspects of aging, and I think it would be helpful for you to talk with someone objective about your adjustment since Dad's death." "Don't need to talk to a psychiatrist, Daniel. I'm managing my grief just fine, and I certainly don't need someone to help me navigate aging." "But Mom, that's exactly the kind of resistance that suggests you might benefit from professional perspective. Sometimes people who are struggling don't have clear insight into their own situation." The appointment with Dr. Martinez was scheduled for the following week, whether I wanted it or not. When I protested that I hadn't consented to psychiatric evaluation, Daniel's response was swift and decisive. "Mom, this isn't optional. As your son, I have a responsibility to make sure you're getting the support you need, even if you don't think you need it." The session with Dr. Martinez was unlike any medical appointment I'd ever experienced. Rather than asking about my physical health, emotional state, or specific concerns, she immediately began probing about my living situation, financial management, and family relationships with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting a competency evaluation. "Mrs. Hartwell, your son has expressed some concerns about your ability to manage independently since your husband's death. Can you tell me about your daily routine and how you're handling household responsibilities?" "Dr. Martinez, I'm not sure what concerns Daniel has shared with you, but I'm managing my household, finances, and personal affairs without any difficulty. I've been living independently for 2 years, and I'm perfectly capable of continuing to do so. But Daniel mentioned some specific incidents that suggest you might be experiencing some challenges. The electrical issue in your basement, some problems with home maintenance, some memory lapses during family conversations. The electrical issue in my basement." What Daniel had described as a dangerous electrical problem had been a single outlet that stopped working, something that happens in every house periodically and requires nothing more than calling an electrician to replace a circuit breaker. I'd scheduled the repair for the following week, but Daniel had insisted on treating it as an emergency that demonstrated my inability to handle basic home maintenance. The problems with home maintenance were similarly manufactured: a loose doorknob that I'd been planning to tighten, a squeaky hinge that needed oil, and a slow drain in the guest bathroom that required a simple cleaning. All normal homeowner issues that Daniel had cataloged as evidence of my declining attention to property care. The memory lapses were the most insidious fabrication. Daniel had begun asking me increasingly specific questions about conversations we'd had weeks or months earlier, then expressing concern when I couldn't recall exact details of discussions that hadn't been particularly important or memorable in the first place. "Mom, don't you remember when we talked about your investment strategy last month? You seemed confused about some of the details, and I had to explain several concepts that you used to understand perfectly well." The conversation he was referencing had been a brief exchange where I'd declined to discuss my investment portfolio with him because I didn't think it was appropriate for him to have detailed knowledge of my financial situation. But in his retelling, to Dr. Martinez, my privacy had become confusion and my boundary setting had become cognitive decline. "Mrs. Hartwell, memory changes can be early indicators of more serious cognitive issues," Dr. Martinez said with the clinical detachment of someone who'd already formed her opinion based on the information Daniel had provided. "Combined with the practical challenges your son has observed, there might be reason for concern about your ability to live safely without additional support. What practical challenges? I maintain my home, manage my finances, drive safely, maintain social relationships, and handle all my personal affairs without assistance. What specific practical challenges are you referring to? Sometimes people experiencing cognitive changes develop very good coping mechanisms that can mask the underlying problems, she replied in the tone of someone who'd been trained to pathologize normal aging. Your son is observing changes that you might not be aware of yourself. The session lasted an hour, during which Dr. Martinez administered several cognitive tests that were designed to identify memory problems, reasoning difficulties, and judgment issues. I passed every assessment with scores that placed me well within normal ranges for my age group. But rather than acknowledging that the test results contradicted Daniel's concerns, Dr. Martinez suggested that good test performance didn't necessarily rule out functional decline in daily living situations. Cognitive testing in clinical settings doesn't always capture the kinds of practical challenges that family members observe in real-world environments. She explained to Daniel during the summary discussion that I was invited to observe but not participate in. Your mother's test scores are good, but that doesn't necessarily contradict your observations about her daily functioning. So what do you recommend? Daniel asked, with the eagerness of someone who'd been hoping for professional validation of his concerns. I think it would be appropriate to continue monitoring the situation closely and consider environmental modifications that could enhance safety and provide additional support. Sometimes a more structured living situation can help maintain independence longer by reducing the cognitive load of household management. Environmental modifications. A more structured living situation. Reducing cognitive load. Dr. Martinez had provided Daniel with the professional language he needed to justify whatever decisions he wanted to make about my living arrangements, regardless of what my actual capabilities or preferences might be. 2 weeks later, Daniel arrived with another folder of documentation and a man he introduced as Tom Wilson, an elder care consultant who specializes in housing transitions. Mom, Tom helps families evaluate living situations and make recommendations about the best options for aging in place or transitioning to more supportive environments. I thought it would be helpful to get his professional assessment of your current situation. Tom Wilson was exactly what you'd expect from someone whose business model depended on convincing families that elderly relatives needed expensive intervention. He was smooth, professional, and expert at identifying problems that required his services to solve. Mrs. Hartwell, I understand you're living alone in a large house that requires significant maintenance and upkeep. That can be challenging for anyone, but particularly for someone dealing with the emotional stress of recent widowhood. Mr. Wilson, I'm not dealing with emotional stress that affects my functioning, and I'm not finding house maintenance challenging. I have reliable contractors for major repairs, and I handle routine maintenance myself or hire appropriate help when needed. But Mrs. Hartwell, your son has shared some specific concerns about safety issues and maintenance problems that suggest the house might be becoming too much for you to handle effectively. The safety issues Tom Wilson referenced were the same. Manufactured problems Daniel had been cataloging for months. The loose handrail that I'd scheduled to be repaired. The basement outlet that needed an electrician. The squeaky door hinge that required 5 minutes with an oil can. But in Tom Wilson's professional assessment, these became evidence of a dangerous pattern of deferred maintenance that put me at risk for accidents, injuries, and property damage. What I typically recommend in situations like this is a comprehensive evaluation of the living environment to identify potential hazards and assess whether modifications could make the space safer or whether transition to a more appropriate setting might be the better option. What kind of modifications are you suggesting? I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. Well, we'd want to look at things like installing grab bars, improving lighting, removing trip hazards, maybe converting some space on the first floor so you wouldn't need to use the stairs as frequently. But honestly, Mrs. Hartwell, Sometimes, the modifications required to make a large house truly safe for an elderly resident end up being so extensive that transitioning to a purpose-built senior living environment becomes the more practical choice. Purpose-built senior living environment. Tom Wilson was selling the same solution that Daniel had been promoting for months, but now it came with professional credentials and the authority of someone who supposedly specialized in these decisions. The eye. Most insidious aspect of Tom Wilson's evaluation was the way he framed independence as a dangerous illusion that families needed to overcome through loving intervention. Mrs. Hartwell, I know that maintaining your independence is important to you, and that's completely understandable. But sometimes real independence means accepting the support systems that allow you to remain as autonomous as possible within a safer framework. Real independence through accepting support systems. It was a masterful piece of manipulation that reframed dependence as empowerment and control as care. The goal isn't to limit your choices, Tom Wilson continued, but to expand your options by removing the barriers that might prevent you from living safely and confidently. Over the following month, Daniel escalated his campaign by involving legal professionals who could provide official documentation of my supposed incompetence and need for supervised care. The first was Patricia Ross, an elder law attorney who specialized in what her website called estate planning and family protection services. Daniel had arranged a consultation under the pretense of helping me update my will and estate planning documents after Robert's death. Mrs. Hartwell, it's important to make sure your estate planning reflects your current situation and provides appropriate protections in case of future incapacity, Patricia Ross explained during our initial meeting. Your son has mentioned some concerns about your ability to manage complex financial decisions independently. Ms. Ross, I don't have any concerns about my ability to manage financial decisions. I've been successfully managing our family's investments and business affairs for decades. But Mrs. Hartwell, financial management can become more challenging with age, and sometimes people don't recognize when they're making decisions that might not be in their best interests. It might be wise to consider documents that would allow your son to assist with financial management if that becomes necessary. The documents Patricia Ross recommended included a durable power of attorney that would give Daniel broad authority over my financial affairs, a healthcare directive that would allow him to make medical decisions on my behalf, and what she called a living will that would specify my preferences for end-of-life care. These documents are just precautionary, she assured me. They wouldn't give your son any authority unless you become unable to make decisions for yourself. But having them in place protects both you and your family if something unexpected happens. The problem was that the definitions of unable to make decisions were subjective and could be triggered by any physician who agreed with Daniel's assessment of my competence. If I signed these documents, Daniel would have legal authority to override my decisions whenever he could find a doctor willing to say that I wasn't thinking clearly. I'm not comfortable signing documents that give someone else authority over my affairs, I told Patricia Ross. I understand the importance of estate planning, but I want to maintain control over my own decisions as long as I'm capable of making them. But Mrs. Hartwell, that's exactly what these documents protect. They ensure that if you ever do become unable to make decisions, someone you trust will make them for you rather than having the court appoint a stranger. Patricia Ross spent the next hour explaining various scenarios where I might need someone else to manage my affairs. Hospitalization, medication side effects, cognitive decline, depression, or simple confusion about complex financial matters. Your son loves you and wants to protect your interests, she said with the practiced sincerity of someone who made her living by convincing elderly clients to sign away their autonomy. These documents just formalize his ability to help you when you need it most. When I continued to resist signing the papers, Patricia Ross suggested that my reluctance itself might be evidence of the judgment problems Daniel had described. Sometimes people who are beginning to experience cognitive changes become suspicious of family members who are trying to help them, she said in the tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. Resistance to reasonable planning can actually be a symptom of the very problems we're trying to address. The legal consultation was followed by a visit from Linda Chen, a social worker who specialized in what her business cards called family dynamics and elder care coordination. Daniel had contacted Linda after researching professional resources for families dealing with aging-related challenges. Mrs. Hartwell, your son has asked me to conduct what we call a social assessment to help your family understand your current needs and develop a plan for ensuring your safety and well-being as you age. Ms. Chen, I don't need a social assessment. I'm living independently, managing my own affairs, and I don't require intervention from anyone. I understand that's how you see your situation, Mrs. Hartwell, but sometimes families observe changes that the individual isn't aware of. Your son has shared some specific concerns about your living situation that suggest you might benefit from additional support. Linda Chen's assessment involved a comprehensive review of my daily routines, social relationships, financial management, healthcare coordination, and what she called functional capacity for independent living. She asked detailed questions about everything from grocery shopping to medication management to household maintenance, with the systematic thoroughness of someone building a case for intervention. How often do you leave the house for social activities? Do you ever feel confused about managing your medications? Have you had any difficulties with cooking, cleaning, or other household tasks? Do you ever feel unsafe living alone? Every question was designed to identify problems that would justify additional supervision or support. When I answered that, I managed all aspects of daily living without difficulty. Linda Chen's follow-up questions became increasingly specific and probing. But your son mentioned that you've had some problems with home maintenance. Can you tell me about the electrical issue in your basement and how you handled that situation? The electrical issue that Daniel had described as evidence of my incompetence had been a routine repair that I'd handled exactly as any homeowner would, by calling an electrician and scheduling the work to be completed promptly. But in Linda Chen's assessment framework, my response to a minor household problem became data about my problem-solving capacity and ability to handle unexpected challenges. Mrs. Hartwell, based on my conversation with your son and my assessment today, I do have some concerns about your current living situation, Linda Chen concluded after 2 hours of questioning. Living alone in a large house can be challenging for anyone, but particularly for someone who's dealing with the emotional stress of recent widowhood and the normal aging process. What specific concerns do you have? Well, there seem to be some issues with home maintenance, some social isolation, and what your son describes as increasing forgetfulness and confusion about financial matters. Individually, these might not be serious problems, but when we see them occurring together, they can indicate that someone might benefit from a more supportive living environment. Issues with home maintenance, social isolation, forgetfulness and confusion about financial matters. Linda Chen had transformed Daniel's manufactured concerns into professional language that made them sound like objective observations rather than manipulative fabrications. What kind of supportive living environment are you recommending? I think the ideal solution would be a living situation that provides security and family support while allowing you to maintain as much independence as possible. Your son has mentioned the possibility of converting space in his home so you could live with family while having your own private area. The attic. Linda Chen was recommending the attic, though she was calling it converted space and private area to make it sound more appealing than storage space above my son's garage. But perhaps the most devastating escalation came when Daniel began using my grandchildren as sources of information about my supposedly declining mental state and concerning behavior patterns. Madison and Mackenzie, who were now 16 and had always been perceptive teenagers, suddenly began receiving detailed instructions from their parents about observing and reporting on their grandmother's behavior during family visits. Girls, we need you to pay attention to Grandma during Sunday dinners. I overheard Jennifer telling them before one family gathering. Notice if she seems confused about things, forgets what we talked about, or says anything that doesn't make sense. We're worried about her, and we need to understand what's really going on. The twins, who had always related to me as their sharp, funny grandmother who remembered every detail of their lives and gave the best advice about everything from school problems to boy troubles, suddenly began treating me like a science experiment they were supposed to monitor. "Grandma, do you remember what we talked about last week about my chemistry project?" Madison would ask with the careful attention of someone testing my memory rather than continuing a conversation. "Grandma, you told the same story about Dad's Little League game twice during dinner," Mackenzie would observe with the concern of a teenager who'd been told to watch for signs of confusion. Our easy, natural relationship gradually became stilted and artificial, as if they were visiting a patient rather than spending time with their grandmother. Every interaction was filtered through their parents' concerns about my mental competence and emotional stability. But the most manipulative aspect of involving the twins was the way Daniel used their observations as evidence that even my grandchildren could see that I was declining. "Mom, Madison, and Mackenzie are worried about you," Daniel said during one particularly aggressive conversation about my living situation. "They've noticed that you seem confused sometimes, that you repeat yourself, that you don't seem as sharp as you used to be. When your own grandchildren can see that something's wrong, don't you think it's time to admit that you might need help?" The final phase of Daniel's escalation involved what he called safety interventions that were actually attempts to create evidence that I couldn't handle basic life responsibilities without constant supervision. He began showing up unannounced at my house with contractors, repairmen, and service providers who were supposedly addressing urgent safety issues that required immediate attention. "Mom, I've brought Miguel Rodriguez to look at your front steps," Daniel announced one morning, arriving with a contractor I'd never met. "There are some loose boards that could be dangerous, and I don't want you to risk falling." The front steps that Miguel Rodriguez was supposedly there to repair were the same steps I'd been using safely for 32 years. They were solid, well-maintained, and showed no signs of dangerous wear or damage. But Miguel had been hired to find problems, and he dutifully identified several safety concerns that required immediate attention. "Mrs. Hartwell, these steps need to be completely rebuilt," Miguel announced after a 15-minute inspection. "The support structure is compromised, and someone could get seriously hurt if we don't address this right away. The cost for rebuilding steps that didn't need rebuilding, $3,200. "Mom, I know it's expensive, but you can't put a price on safety," Daniel said when I protested that the work seemed unnecessary. "What if you fell and broke your hip because we didn't take care of this problem?" When I said I wanted to get a second opinion from a contractor I knew and trusted, Daniel made it clear that delay wasn't an option. "Mom, we can't wait for you to research other options. Miguel is here now. He's identified a serious safety hazard, and we need to take care of it immediately. Every day we wait is another day you're at risk." The work was completed before I could arrange for another contractor to assess whether it was actually necessary, and the $3,200 bill was just the beginning of a series of urgent safety improvements that began draining my liquid cash while creating a documented history of expensive emergency repairs that supported Daniel's argument that maintaining my house was becoming financially unsustainable. Over the following months, there were emergency repairs to my driveway, my roof, my heating system, and my plumbing. Each crisis was presented as a safety issue that couldn't wait for competitive bidding or careful consideration. Each expense was accompanied by reminders that these kinds of unexpected costs were exactly why elderly homeowners should consider moving to maintenance-free living situations. "Mom, when you're living with family, you won't have to worry about these constant repair bills," Jennifer said after the fourth emergency repair invoice arrived. "The stress of maintaining this big house is clearly becoming too much for you to handle." But perhaps the most insidious escalation was the way Daniel began involving my neighbors in his campaign, by positioning himself as the responsible son who was trying to protect the neighborhood from the problems created by an elderly resident who couldn't properly maintain her property, Mrs. Patterson, who lived across the street and had been a friend for over 20 years, began receiving visits from Daniel where he expressed concerns about my ability to keep up with yard work and property maintenance. Mrs. Patterson, I hope you'll let me know if you notice any problems with Mom's house or yard, Daniel said during one of these conversations that I learned about later. She's having trouble keeping up with everything, and I want to make sure her property issues don't affect the neighborhood. Property issues that affect the neighborhood. Daniel was implying that my house was becoming an eyesore or liability. That could impact everyone's property values, when in fact my home was one of the best-maintained properties on our street. Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived next door and had been our neighbors for 15 years, began receiving similar visits, where Daniel positioned himself as the overwhelmed son who was trying to manage his mother's declining situation. I know Mom seems fine when you talk to her, but we're seeing some concerning changes at home, Daniel told them during one of his neighborhood rounds. If you ever notice anything that seems off, packages left outside, lights left on all night, any signs that she might be having trouble, I hope you'll call me right away. The brilliant manipulation was that Daniel was recruiting my neighbors as surveillance agents who would report any behavior that could be interpreted as evidence of decline or incompetence. A package delivered when I wasn't home became potential evidence that I was confused about deliveries. Leaving lights on for security became possible proof that I was forgetting to turn them off. By the time Daniel staged his final intervention, the Sunday dinner where he presented his attic proposal, and made it clear that my independence was no longer negotiable, he had successfully created an comprehensive ecosystem of professional validation, family consensus, legal documentation, and neighborhood surveillance that made his decisions about my living situation seem not only reasonable, but inevitable. On paper, his case was overwhelming. Multiple professionals had raised concerns about my cognitive function and safety. Legal experts had recommended protective documents. Social workers had identified risks in my current living situation. Healthcare providers had noted potential problems. Even my own grandchildren had observed concerning changes. Emergency repairs had demonstrated that maintaining my house was becoming financially unsustainable. Neighbors were being asked to monitor my behavior for signs of trouble. The reality that a competent, financially successful, emotionally stable woman was being systematically destroyed by a son who needed to control her in order to feel important was buried under an avalanche of official documentation and professional opinions that made my protests sound like exactly what they'd been designed to sound like. The confused objections of someone who lacked insight into her own decline. But Daniel had made one crucial mistake in his escalation campaign. He had been so focused on building external validation for his concerns that he had never bothered to investigate whether those concerns were based on actual evidence or manufactured crisis. He thought he had documented my incompetence. In reality, he had documented his own systematic manipulation of professionals who were willing to pathologize normal aging and family members who were eager to defer to his authority. He thought he had proven that I needed intervention. In reality, he had proven that he was willing to spend thousands of dollars and involve dozens of people in an elaborate campaign to justify controlling his mother's life. He thought he had created an airtight case for why the attic solution was necessary and appropriate. In reality, he had created a perfect record of how far he was willing to go to avoid accepting that his mother was more capable, more successful, and more independent than he would ever be. The house sale that would happen in the next few days wasn't just about proving him wrong. It was about demonstrating that every professional he'd consulted, every document he'd created, and every concern he'd manufactured had been based on nothing more than his own need to diminish a woman whose success threatened his sense of himself as the family's competent adult. The escalation tactics that were supposed to prove my incompetence were about to become evidence of his systematic campaign to undermine. a woman who was far more capable than he'd ever given her credit for. And the attic proposal that was supposed to be my acceptance of defeat was about to become the catalyst for the most spectacular demonstration of competence and independence of my entire life. The morning after the house sale closed, I woke up in my soon-to-be former bedroom for the last time and felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Pure, unadulterated excitement about controlling my own destiny. The $2.3 million deposit had hit my account at 9 a.m. By 9:15 a.m., I was making the phone calls that would transform Eleanor Hartwell from the confused elderly woman who needed attic housing into the woman whose success would force everyone who'd underestimated her to question every assumption they'd ever made about aging, competence, and family dynamics. My first call was to Rebecca Martinez, the real estate agent who'd managed the Newton house sale with the efficiency of someone who understood she was working with a serious player, not a confused, elderly seller who needed handholding. Rebecca, it's Eleanor. The Newton sale went through perfectly. Now I want to talk about the next phase of my strategy. Eleanor, congratulations. What did you have in mind? I want to purchase 2 more investment properties in the next 6 months. I have $1.8 million in liquid capital from the house sale, plus the Martha's Vineyard property is already secured. I'm thinking 1 multifamily property in Somerville and 1 single-family renovation project in Cambridge. Eleanor, you just made my entire year. Let me pull together some options that fit your investment criteria. The second call was to James Chen at Hartwell & Associates, my financial advisor who'd been quietly building my wealth while Daniel worried about my ability to balance a checkbook. James, it's Eleanor. The house sale closed this morning. I want to move forward with the aggressive investment strategy we discussed. And James, I want you to prepare a comprehensive financial summary that documents everything I've accomplished since Robert's death. I have a feeling I'm going to need it soon. Absolutely, Eleanor. Should I include the real estate portfolio, the business, income, the investment returns, and the Martha's Vineyard purchase? Include everything. Net worth, monthly income, year-over-year growth, property values, investment performance. I want a document that shows exactly what Eleanor Hartwell has been building while certain people thought she was declining. The third call was to Martha Stewart's assistant. Yes, that Martha Stewart. 3 months earlier, I'd been featured in a small article in Boston Magazine about hidden real estate gems in Cambridge. The piece had mentioned my Victorian duplex renovation and included quotes from my tenants about the quality of the finished apartments. Apparently, someone on Martha's team had seen the article and reached out about featuring my property work on her lifestyle show. At the time, I'd politely declined because I wasn't ready for that level of public attention while Daniel was actively trying to undermine my credibility. But now I was ready to show the world exactly what Eleanor Hartwell was capable of. This is Eleanor Hartwell. I'm calling about the property renovation feature that Martha's team inquired about earlier this year. Is that opportunity still available? Within 2 hours, I had a preliminary filming schedule for a segment about innovative small space living and property investment strategies for active seniors. The show would feature my Cambridge duplex, discuss my investment philosophy, and position me as an expert on post-retirement wealth building through real estate. The irony was exquisite. While Daniel was consulting geriatric psychiatrists about my supposed cognitive decline, Martha Stewart's producers were interested in my expertise about complex investment strategies. But the fourth call was the one that would change everything. Daniel thought he knew about his mother's financial situation and professional reputation. This is Eleanor Hartwell calling for David Chen at the Boston Globe real estate section. David Chen was a business journalist who'd been following the Boston real estate market for 15 years. I'd met him at several investment seminars, and he'd occasionally quoted me in articles about market trends and renovation strategies. More importantly, he understood that Eleanor Hartwell was a legitimate real estate professional, not a confused elderly woman playing with property. David, I have a story for you that's going to be unlike anything you've covered before. Eleanor, what do you have in mind? I want to document what happens when adult children systematically underestimate their elderly parents' capabilities and financial resources. I've just sold my family home for $2.3 million while my son was trying to convince me to live in his attic because he thought the house might be worth $900,000 if we were lucky. That's quite a gap. What's the broader story here? The broader story is about ageism within families, the way competent elderly women get dismissed and controlled by children who can't see past their own assumptions about aging. But more importantly, it's about what happens when those elderly women have been quietly building wealth and expertise while their families thought they were declining. How wealthy are we talking about? $8.3 million net worth, $2,300 monthly passive income from rental properties, and a track record of real estate investments that have outperformed the market by double digits over the past 3 years. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted nearly 30 seconds. Eleanor, this is a front-page story. When can we start? The Globe interview was scheduled for the following week, with a photographer who would document my properties and business operations. But more importantly, David Chen understood that this story had implications far beyond one family's dynamics. Eleanor, this touches on some of the biggest social issues we're facing. Elder abuse disguised as family concern, the systematic underestimation of women's financial capabilities, and the way ageism prevents society from recognizing the expertise and resources that older adults bring to the economy. The moving process began that Friday with a crew that Daniel would later describe as, like something from a movie. Professional movers, packing specialists, and a coordination team that treated my belongings with the care normally reserved for museum pieces. But the most satisfying aspect of moving day was the way Daniel and Jennifer reacted when they realized the scope and expense of my relocation plans. Daniel arrived unannounced on Saturday morning, expecting to find me packing boxes and organizing a garage sale. Instead, he found professional movers loading custom-built shipping containers with furniture that was being transported to Martha's Vineyard by a specialty company that handled high-value relocations. Mom, what's going on here? This looks like you're moving a museum collection. I'm moving to Martha's Vineyard, Daniel, just like I told you when I called about the house sale. But this is really expensive. How are you paying for all this? The same way I've been paying for everything since your father died, with my own money from my own successful investments and business operations. Jennifer walked around the moving operation with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. Professional movers were handling antiques with white gloves. Art pieces were being wrapped in museum-quality protective materials, and everything was being inventoried with the precision of someone relocating a valuable collection. Eleanor, this level of moving service must cost a fortune, Jennifer said with the tone of someone who'd never hired anything more expensive than a local moving company with a truck. It costs exactly what it's supposed to cost when you're relocating, valuable belongings, and you want them handled properly. But the real moment of truth came when Daniel saw the moving truck from Peterson Fine Arts Transportation, a company that specialized in relocating high-value collections for museums, galleries, and wealthy collectors. Mom, why would you hire art movers? We don't have anything that valuable. Daniel, apparently you don't know what we have, but I do. The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we'd ever had. For the first time in 2 years, Daniel was asking questions instead of making pronouncements about my capabilities and limitations. Mom, I need to understand what's happening here. This house sold for way more than we expected. You're moving to Martha's Vineyard. You're hiring expensive professional services. Where is all this money coming from? It's coming from the real estate business I've been building for the past 3 years. The investment portfolio I've been managing since your father's death. And the wealth your father and I accumulated over 43 years of marriage. What real estate business? What investment portfolio? You never mentioned any business or investments. I never mentioned them because you never asked about my actual activities. You were too busy consulting psychiatrists about my supposed cognitive decline to notice that I was building a property empire. A property empire? Mom, what are you talking about? That's when I decided to show him exactly what his mother had been accomplishing while he was worrying about her competence. I pulled out the financial summary that James Chen had prepared, a comprehensive document that detailed every aspect of my wealth building since Robert's death, including property acquisitions, renovation projects, rental income, investment returns, and net worth calculations. Daniel, this is what your mother has been doing while you thought she needed attic housing. The summary was devastating in its thoroughness. Property portfolio, Somerville 3-family, purchased $485K, renovated $65K, current value $850K, monthly net income $4,300, Cambridge duplex, purchased $890K, renovated $180K, current value 1.6 meters, monthly net income $6,800 Porter Square 4 unit, purchased 1.2 manors, renovated 240K, current value 1.9 manors, monthly net income $19,200 Martha's Vineyard waterfront, purchased 1.8 Mueller's cash financial performance, total real estate portfolio value, $515 million monthly passive income, $2,300 annual gross income, $287,000 3-year return on investment, 34% average annual growth liquid assets, $1.2 million plus $2.3 million from Newton House sale net. Worth $835 million. Daniel stared at the document for nearly 5 minutes without speaking. When he finally looked up, his face was pale, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Mom, this says you're worth over $8 million. That's correct. And you're generating over $20,000 a month in rental income. That's also correct. But we thought you were struggling financially. We thought you needed help managing your money. You thought I was struggling because you never bothered to learn about my actual financial situation. You assumed I was incompetent because it made you feel important to think you were managing my decline. Jennifer had been reading over Daniel's shoulder, and her reaction was even more dramatic than his. Eleanor, this document shows you've been buying and renovating properties while we thought you were having trouble maintaining your own house. I wasn't having trouble maintaining my house, Jennifer. I was strategically preparing to sell it at maximum value while building wealth through real estate investments that you knew nothing about. But the emergency repairs, the safety issues, the problems with maintenance, were manufactured crises that Daniel created to justify his intervention in my life. Every emergency repair was unnecessary work that I paid for to avoid conflict while I planned my exit strategy. The confrontation continued for another hour, with Daniel and Jennifer alternating between shock, disbelief, and what seemed suspiciously like resentment that I had turned out to be far more successful than they'd ever imagined. Mom, if you had all this money, why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us worry about your finances? I let you worry because you never asked about my actual situation. You assumed I was struggling, and when I tried to explain that I was managing fine, you interpreted my independence as confusion. But we were just trying to help. You were trying to control. There's a difference, Daniel. The Boston Globe article was published 3 weeks later with the headline, "The $8 Million Secret: How One Newton Woman Built a Real Estate Empire While Her Family Planned Her Decline." The piece was a masterwork of investigative journalism that documented not just my financial success, but the systematic campaign Daniel had waged to undermine my credibility and autonomy. David Chen had interviewed the professionals Daniel had consulted, the contractors who'd performed unnecessary work, and the neighbors who'd been recruited to monitor my behavior. But perhaps most damaging to Daniel's reputation was the way the article framed his actions within the broader context of elder abuse and financial manipulation, disguised as family concern. Eleanor Hartwell's story raises troubling questions about how families can systematically undermine competent elderly relatives through manufactured crises, unnecessary professional consultations, and the pathologizing of normal aging behaviors. David Chen wrote, "While Ms. Hartwell was building an impressive real estate portfolio and generating substantial wealth, her son was consulting geriatric psychiatrists about her supposed cognitive decline and pressuring her to sign legal documents that would have given him control over her finances. The article included photographs of my properties, documentation of my investment returns, and quotes from my tenants and professional associates who described me as one of the most competent and knowledgeable property investors they'd worked with." But the real impact came from the sidebar story that documented the cost of Daniel's intervention campaign. Over $15,000 in unnecessary professional consultations, $12,000 in manufactured emergency repairs, and legal fees for documents designed to give him control over assets he didn't know existed. The irony, David Chen concluded, is that Daniel Hartwell spent nearly $30,000 trying to prove that his mother was incompetent to manage money, while Eleanor Hartwell was generating over $240,000 in annual income from real estate investments he knew nothing about. The Globe article was picked up by national news outlets within 48 hours. By the end of the week, I was receiving interview requests from NPR, CNN, and 60 Minutes. The story had touched a nerve about elder abuse, family dynamics, and the systematic underestimation of older women's capabilities. But the most satisfying response came from other elderly women who wrote to tell me that my story had inspired them to resist family members who were trying to control their lives and resources. "Eleanor, your story made me realize that my daughter's concerns about my financial confusion were really about her desire to access my inheritance while I'm still alive," wrote a 73-year-old woman from Seattle. "I've started my own investment account and hired a financial advisor who treats me like the competent adult I am. Reading about your real estate success convinced me to start the business I've been planning for years," wrote a 68-year-old woman from Phoenix. "If you can build an empire while your family thinks you're declining, I can certainly open the consulting practice I've been putting off." The Martha Stewart Show aired 6 weeks after the Globe article, featuring a segment called Ageless Ambition, Building Wealth After 70. The show documented my property renovation strategies, my investment philosophy, and my advice for other seniors who wanted to build wealth rather than simply manage decline. Eleanor Hartwell proves that 70 is not the end of your productive years. It's the beginning of your freedom to pursue excellence without seeking anyone's permission, Martha Stewart said during the introduction. Her story challenges every assumption we make about aging, competence, and what's possible when you refuse to accept other people's limitations on your potential. The show generated over 50,000 emails from viewers who were inspired by the demonstration that age was irrelevant when it came to building wealth, pursuing ambitious projects, and refusing to accept other people's definitions of what was appropriate for seniors. But perhaps the most gratifying recognition came 6 months later, when I was invited to speak at the Harvard Business School about entrepreneurship and wealth building in later life. The same institution where Daniel had struggled to complete his MBA was now featuring his mother as an expert on business strategy and financial management. The lecture hall was packed with students, faculty, and business professionals who wanted to understand how someone could build substantial wealth starting at age 68, while simultaneously dealing with family members who were convinced she was incompetent. "The most important lesson from my experience," I told the Harvard audience, "is that competence, creativity, and ambition don't diminish with age. They actually improve when you're no longer worried about other people's approval and can focus entirely on your own vision of what's possible." The questions from the audience were sophisticated and challenging, covering everything from market analysis to contractor management to the psychology of family dynamics. But the question that generated the most interest came from a third-year MBA student who asked about the broader implications of my story. "Ms. Hartwell, Your experience suggests that there might be substantial untapped economic potential in older adults who are being systematically underestimated by their families and society. Do you think there are other people like you who are being prevented from contributing to the economy because of ageist assumptions? I think there are thousands of people like me, I replied. Competent, capable, financially sophisticated older adults who are being told they need supervision rather than being recognized as resources who could contribute to economic growth, innovation, and wealth creation. The Harvard lecture was recorded and posted online, generating over 200,000 views in the first month. More importantly, it established me as a thought leader on issues related to aging, entrepreneurship, and the economic potential of older adults. But the most personally satisfying vindication came exactly 1 year after Daniel's attic proposal, when Madison and Mackenzie asked if they could spend the summer with me at Martha's Vineyard. "Grandma, we want to learn about real estate investing," Madison said during the call. "Mom and Dad told us you've been really successful with property, investments, and we want to understand how you built your business." "We've been reading about your story online," Mackenzie added. "We think it's really cool that you proved everyone wrong about what grandmothers are supposed to be capable of." That summer, I taught my granddaughters about market analysis, property evaluation, renovation planning, and financial management. They helped me research potential investments, accompanied me to property showings, and learned to calculate return on investment, cash flow analysis, and market timing strategies. More importantly, they learned that their grandmother wasn't the confused elderly woman their parents had described, but a successful businesswoman who had built substantial wealth through intelligence, hard work, and strategic decision-making. "Grandma, why did Mom and Dad think you needed help with money?" Madison asked during one of our property scouting trips. "You obviously know way more about investing than they do. Your parents made assumptions about my capabilities based on my age rather than my actual performance," I explained. "They thought being 70 meant I was automatically less competent, when actually it meant I had more experience and fewer distractions." "That's really stupid," Mackenzie observed with the clarity that comes from being 16 and not yet trained to accept social conventions. "Age doesn't make people dumber. If anything, you're smarter than most of the adults we know." The reconciliation with Daniel and Jennifer happened gradually over the course of that first year. It began with a grudging acknowledgement that they had misunderstood my financial situation, evolved into uncomfortable apologies for their over-concern about my capabilities, and eventually became something approaching genuine respect for what I had accomplished. But the most significant change was in the way they began treating me during family interactions. Instead of speaking to me like a confused elderly relative who needed protection from complex decisions, they started asking for my advice about their own financial planning, investment strategies, and business opportunities. "Mom, Jennifer, and I are thinking about refinancing our house," Daniel said during one Sunday dinner conversation. "Do you think now is a good time to restructure our mortgage, or should we wait for interest rates to change?" "Mom, my friend Sarah, is thinking about buying a rental property as an investment," Jennifer added. "Do you have any advice about what she should look for and what she should avoid?" The questions weren't patronizing gestures designed to make me feel included. They were genuine requests for expertise from someone they finally recognized as more knowledgeable about financial matters than they were. But perhaps the most meaningful vindication came during a family gathering where Daniel publicly acknowledged how wrong he had been about my capabilities and judgment. "I owe Mom a major apology," he said to the assembled family members who had been told for years that I was declining and needed intervention. "I spent 2 years trying to convince everyone that she needed help managing her life, while she was actually building a business empire that puts my own career achievements to shame. We thought we were being responsible adult children," Jennifer added, "but we were actually preventing a competent, successful businesswoman from getting the recognition and respect she deserved." The admission was more satisfying than any professional recognition, or financial milestone, because it meant that the people who mattered most in my life finally understood that Eleanor Hartwell was not someone who needed management. She was someone whose capabilities exceeded their own. Today, 3 years after Daniel suggested I live in his attic, I operate Eleanor Hartwell Property Solutions from my waterfront home office in Martha's Vineyard. My real estate portfolio now includes 7 properties worth over $12 million. My monthly passive income exceeds $35,000. My net worth has grown to $11.8 million. But more importantly, I live as a woman who understands that competence, ambition, and the ability to build wealth don't have expiration dates. I live as someone who has proven that the only limits on our lives are the ones we accept from people who don't understand our true capabilities. My story has been featured in documentaries about elder abuse, academic studies about family dynamics, and business, case studies about late-life entrepreneurship. I speak regularly at conferences about aging, women's financial empowerment, and the economic potential of older adults. But the most rewarding aspect of my vindication is the hundreds of letters I receive from other elderly women who have been inspired to resist family members trying to control their lives and pursue their own visions of what's possible after 70. Eleanor, your story gave me the courage to leave my daughter's house and start my own business, wrote a 74-year-old woman. From Denver, I'm now running a successful consulting practice and proving that my daughter's concerns about my declining capabilities were really about her need to feel important. Reading about your real estate success inspired me to pursue the art career I put on hold when I became a mother 45 years ago, wrote a 71-year-old woman from Portland. I've had 3 gallery shows this year and sold more paintings than I ever imagined possible. The woman Daniel wanted to relegate to attic housing became the woman whose success challenged every assumption about aging, competence, and what's possible when you refuse to accept other people's definitions of your potential. The living situation he thought was appropriate for someone my age became the catalyst for building wealth that exceeded his wildest imagination. The intervention he staged to solve my problems became the foundation for proving that the only problem was his inability to recognize his mother's actual capabilities. At 73 years old, I continue to acquire properties, build wealth, and pursue projects that demonstrate what's possible when you have the resources, experience, and freedom to create exactly the life you want without seeking anyone's permission. The attic he offered as charity became the foundation for my empire. The underestimation he meant as protection became the motivation for my greatest achievements, and the family dynamics he thought he controlled became the catalyst for proving that Eleanor Hartwell was never someone who needed management. She was someone whose success would inspire thousands of others to reject artificial limitations and pursue excellence at any age. The reckoning was complete, spectacular, and absolutely magnificent. And it proved that the most expensive mistake of Daniel's life was assuming that his 70-year-old mother was someone who needed his supervision rather than someone whose capabilities would ultimately surpass his own, in every measurable way. That lesson has made all the difference, not just for our family, but for every person who has learned from my story that age is just a number when you refuse to accept other people's limitations on your potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.